Hi, I'm Dr. Tom Curtis, GP by background and medical lead at Aviva, and I work in the Tier 3 weight management service here. And very grateful for you joining me today. I was just going to talk a little bit about the obesity challenge, where the new GLP-1 medications fit into that, and what it means to not have these medicines available at the moment. As we know, there's been a global shortage, which has been somewhat difficult to manage, but it doesn't mean that weight management is dead in the meantime. So we'll just talk through how we're approaching that and what other options we can provide. So just to set the context, we know that over 1 in 4 adults in the UK are living with obesity, and it's about a third that are living with some degree of being overweight, and this has huge implications for the healthcare system. So latest figures suggest that a patient living with obesity accrues 25% more in terms of healthcare spend, and that the UK is currently spending just over £6 billion in costs directly relating to managing obesity, as per government figures. And then obesity doesn't affect the population equally. As the Marmot Review highlighted, obesity largely affects those in the most deprived areas disproportionately. So it grows health inequalities as well. So there's lots of vital reasons that we tackle this in a coordinated manner. And Tier 3 specialist weight management service is definitely a part of that puzzle. And the focus today is really on where the GLP-1s fit within a Tier 3 service. And then we'll discuss what it means, as I said, not to have these available to us. So the headlines with regards to GLP-1s are, they're certainly novel. They work largely by suppressing calorie intake. They make patients less hungry, and they're highly effective in that regard. Despite them being injectable devices, we found that they're easily administered. We start these patients largely on a remote basis, using videos, one-to-one consultations, written materials. And as a result of that, we find 90-95% satisfaction and confidence with patients starting these. But one of the more contentious issues relating to GLP-1s is that NICE and the NHS supplies them for 2 years for eligible patients, and we can have a quick discussion about what we think that means in terms of service provision. So the next slide just makes the point that we are really undergoing a revolution in terms of pharmacotherapy that we've got available to treat obesity. As you may know, previously, before the first GLP-1 Saxenda became available, we really only had Orlistat in our armoury of drugs to use to tackle obesity. And as most practitioners found, this was minimally effective. That may be because it was prescribed not alongside very high quality diet and lifestyle interventions, but most practitioners found that it was of limited benefit in their patients that were living with obesity. I think things have changed with Saxenda. The average weight loss in the large studies is about 8 to 9%. When we combine it with an intensive lifestyle intervention with a run-in period, we see average weight loss is higher than that. And we have got patients who've lost up to a quarter of their body weight combining Saxenda with our lifestyle interventions. We then move on to the new drugs that are hopefully coming on stream soon, Wegovy and tirzepatide, and there over a 10% weight loss is the rule rather than the exception. So these are really exciting agents, but it does mean we've got a real demand challenge coming, or it's already arrived. If you look at the next graph along, we can see that Saxenda did cause some ripples. People started searching for injectable weight loss therapies, but really once Wegovy was announced with its much higher efficacy, we can see that there's a real explosion in demand. NICE have also deemed that Wegovy should be used in a broader population, so we estimate that 4 times the number of patients coming into a Tier 3 weight service will be eligible for these drugs. So that demand combined with the increased eligibility means there's this massive unmet need potentially when we do have good availability of these drugs. And I think that's where Aviva can really plug the gap. We've proven that these drugs can safely be started and managed by a remote service such as Aviva. I just want to finish now just thinking about maybe the slight problems we have. One being the time-limited nature of these drugs, and two, the fact that there are supply chain issues, which means that we cannot get them at the moment. In terms of the 2-year time limit that's currently imposed, we know that if you stop the drug, you seem to rebound and regain weight quite quickly, as per the Step 1 extension study. What we're not sure of, and what we think we can intervene with, is what happens if we provide very high-style diet and lifestyle and embed behaviour change during that transition phase. And we've learned from our total diet replacement, where we provide 8 to 12 weeks of liquid diet, that we can sustain people's weight loss for a long time, 1 to 2 years after the intervention. And we're hopeful that with our skills and with our accumulated knowledge, we can provide solutions for patients there. And then in terms of the drugs not currently being available, it is frustrating, and it is a shame that we've lost this tool which was newly provided to us. But we still have very effective options like that total diet replacement I mentioned, where patients can lose 10 to 12% of their body weight on average, which is analogous with Saxenda weight loss outcomes. And some patients prefer not adding to their therapeutic burden. And maybe it's appropriate that therapeutic should not be the first step, and we do try these intensive interventions first. So I'd really implore you not to defer referring patients to the Tier 3 service, because there are still options and we still do see great weight loss outcomes. And the supply chain is uncertain. It may be that when the patient's in the service, these drugs become available and we can restart. So yeah, thank you for joining me today, and hope to see you again soon.
Hi everyone, and welcome. We're here today with the lovely Dr. Tom Curtis, who is going to help me complete our conversations or continue our conversations around GLP-1s, which has been in the media a lot recently, both because of the huge advantages in using GLP-1, but unfortunately the recent supply shortage issues, and what we as clinicians and in the NHS we can do about that. So Tom, welcome. Would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Thanks very much, Karen. Yeah, wonderful to be here. So I'm Dr. Tom Curtis, as you say. I'm a GP by background, and I've done some additional training in diabetes and weight management as well. And I act as medical lead for Aviva, which is a very privileged position to be in. So yeah, it's great to be here. And I'm looking forward to this discussion because it's interesting times in the world of GLP-1s, as you've said.
Indeed. Thank you, Tom. And I'm Karen Miller. I am a diabetes dietitian by background, with about 21 years now of experience in working as a dietitian, with the majority of that in diabetes, both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and most recently in the world of remission, where I have visibly been able to see the benefits of significant weight loss on people clinically and metabolically. But we're not here today to talk about diabetes, but more about weight management and our weight management services. And Tom, recently, I think it was just yesterday, I read a paper on where researchers were actually asking for us to start thinking about calling obesity something different, that the word obesity only really alluded to the body mass index, and that it didn't suggest that this was as complex as we know it is, both in its nature, but also in its causes. Do you welcome that kind of attention, Tom? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I do. I think there has been a trend to particularly maybe in the mainstream media, to an oversimplification of obesity as a disease, as an entity. And I think when you think in those oversimplistic terms, maybe you try and come up with overly simplistic solutions to this problem. So I think recognizing for what it is, probably a chronic relapsing remitting condition that requires quite intensive treatment, anything that changes that mindset, I think is a great benefit. And I think one of the risks that we face, we've had this wonderful news about these new class of medications that could potentially solve obesity, these GLP-1 medicines. Again, I don't think there's ever going to be a single solution for obesity. So although it's slightly crushing news that these new game-changing drugs, as they're termed, are now not available, I don't think it's the end of the road by any means. We always knew that it was never going to be GLP-1s alone to manage obesity. So yeah, it'd be good if we think about and discuss some of the other options during this time.
So GLP-1s were really exciting. And I think for us at Oviva, we very much saw them as a tool in our toolkit. But we were very aware that GLP-1s they're not a magic wand. They were not the only thing that someone needed to do. And it didn't mean that someone didn't have to put the hard work in, didn't have to do the behavior change. It just made it a little bit easier for people. What are we going to do now that for the next possibly 18 months, we don't have GLP-1s as one of the tools in our toolkit? How else are we going to plug this gap?
Well, I think hopefully we've already got a partial solution that we've already been using. I think there has been a shift in the academic literature and some of the key researchers in the field that maybe we shouldn't be using pharmacological therapies first line anyway in obesity. We do now have these total diet replacement approaches which have got a lot of evidence behind them. So this is where you replace meals with a liquid formula to get people on just above 800 calories a day, which is quite a significant calorie restriction. But if you manage to maintain that, and a lot of people do for 8 to 12 weeks, you're guaranteed quite a significant weight loss in the order of magnitude of 10 to 15% of your body weight. And we know that those weight losses not only last, so the evidence shows that at least 2 to 3 years out on average, people are still lighter than they were before the 8 to 12 week intervention. If you do the risk assessments, people also have lowered their cardiovascular risk as a result of becoming lighter. And cleverer studies have been done looking at things called like proteomic markers to try and assess cardiovascular risk. And again, it proves that weight loss through any means, but particularly through this TDR approach has been studied, lowers cardiovascular risk. So there is hope, and Oviva is expert in providing these total diet replacement approaches, as you well know, Karen, because you're intimately involved in that in the diabetes space. So I think there's a potential solution and glimmer of light, particularly for the diabetes patients who maybe have never had this intensive lifestyle weight loss approach before, who can't get hold of their GLP-1s, to ask about coming on intensive weight management programs like a tier 3 to see if they can try the non-pharmacological approaches to their diabetes management. And I think it can be really exciting. Again, as you've seen, I'm sure you've got countless stories of people coming off all their medications and living diabetes drug-free. And it may not be that that's their entire life then. Hopefully it is, but even if you delay intensive treatment by 5, 10 years, it has massive benefits in terms of health outcomes.
And I think some of the risk with those patients is some of the alternatives. So the other medications that would be prescribed would often lead to weight gain. And again, no cardiovascular protection. So that's wonderful to hear you think that as well, Tom. And so a question I'm often asked, though, is TDR, total diet replacement. So not eating anything. There's no way my patient's going to want to do that. What do you think? Do people want to do it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the knee-jerk response is, no, that sounds impossible, doesn't it? We see that about 8 out of 10 people who come through to our tier 3 intensive weight management service are eligible for TDR. At the moment, we can't offer it to people on insulin. We're currently trying to do trials to change that. But at present, that's the main blocker. But 8 out of 10 people are eligible. And actually, the majority are very interested in the approach, and the majority manage the approach very well. So the first, and you're more expert in this than me, Karen, but the first 24, 48 hours is the hardest because your hunger drive has not been suppressed at that point. But going down to such a low calorie level has a natural appetite suppressant effect. So if you get over the first few days, you've got a very high chance of staying on the approach. And people generally tolerate it very well. People worry ahead of time that they're going to feel exhausted and not be able to manage life. But again, we see probably the majority saying they feel better, more energetic on it. So actually, strangely enough, the intensive calorie restriction period, a lot of people say is the easy part, and then reintroducing food can be where, you need that really expert dietetic and dietitian input to manage that transition. But it's, most people would be eligible for this approach if they're entering a tier 3 weight management service, and most people would do really well with that approach. I'm not sure what your experience is, whether you've got anything to add to that, Karen.
I think for me, the total diet replacement really allows people to have not just that physical break from food, but that emotional and psychological break from food. If anyone has ever tried to lose even just a little bit of weight, we all know how exhausting that is. You're constantly making decisions. What should I have for my lunch? If I have that, that's going to lead to that. And that can be quite wearing. And allowing people to make that decision on the day that they start TDR, that's where the hard work is often, the constant decision making is then out the way. They've made the decision and they know what's going on. I also think it's the support that goes with the TDR that's crucial. You could go along to the supermarkets and buy meal replacements, but that is not actually allowing the reflection, the learning. You need that conversation with your coach. You need that conversation with your clinician who understands your journey to think about the difference between hunger and habit. GLP-1's the same. GLP-1 didn't address those times where we eat because we're not just for hunger, we eat for so many other reasons. And we need someone to support that journey, whether it's with GLP-1s, whether it's with TDR, whether it's with another tool in our toolkit, to really allow that reflection and that understanding and to start to totally rebuild their relationship with food. And I think that's where any of these tools in our toolkit, we need that support to go alongside it to allow that patient to really come out of it the other end with a different relationship, not just with food, but with themselves as well. And I do think TDR allows people who've probably struggled with their weight their whole life to actually start to feel like they can do this, because they do start to see those changes, and those changes quickly, and that can be really empowering and build people up as well. Allow them to feel like, hey, I can do this. I am worth doing this for, which is just as a dietitian working with these people is wonderful to support someone in that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there just needs to be a shift in mindset, doesn't there? That this TDR can be almost thought of as a very highly effective drug treatment, both for weight loss and for diabetes management.
We see those improvements in glycemic control and blood pressure. So indeed, it goes beyond just calories in versus calories out.
Yeah, it has remarkable physiological effects. So very quickly you start with this kind of degree of calorie restriction. You start offloading, getting rid of the fat in your pancreas and liver. Your metabolic health quite quickly improves, and that has all kinds of peripheral beneficial effects. So it's a targeted, evidence-based intervention, and I'd be really keen just for GPs, practice nurses, any medical professional to think of TDR as a complementary approach for weight management and diabetes, particularly at this time when we haven't got the GLP-1s available to step up to. I think the risk is that where GLP-1s sit in the NICE algorithm at the moment for diabetes, they're fourth line. And so often the next step in people's minds is, well, I've got nothing other than insulin to transfer these patients onto. We know that insulin in type 2 diabetes doesn't reduce cardiovascular risk. There's obviously risk of hypoglycemic events, which are fairly catastrophic. Whereas TDR doesn't have those problems, and it's acting at a much more, I think, physiological level. It's acting on hyperinsulinemia, that peripheral insulin resistance. So I'd be very keen for people to at least be offered this and trial it before clinicians thought about that transition to insulin, unless there was obviously overt beta cell failure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's just getting the word out there, isn't it, and getting people to think of this as an approach. And I think tier 3 is a great place for people to have this done in a very controlled, professional, well-researched manner.
Thank you, Tom. And I think that what I take away as I conclude is that we are not just this isn't about making people thin. This is about creating health and getting people really, really psychologically and physically well. And that multidisciplinary team is what will allow for that to happen. So Tom, thank you for your thoughts. We did get some great questions come in. I hope we've covered some of them in our discussion today. If we haven't, we'll be sure to message you separately just to make sure that we've tied up any loose ends, so you will hear from us as well. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us today.